So finally, this week we're going to be talking about the School of Athens itself. And in this first section, we're going to talk about its composition, or how it's organized, and its technique, the mechanical process by which Raphael actually painted it. Now, what we're looking at is philosophers in space. What's essential to the painting is the idea that we've got an active scene of people doing things within this grand classical space. And the space itself is a part of the story, and it has something to do with the meaning. Now, the space is perpendicular to our line of sight. So it's essentially a great vaulted hall. Part of it is parallel to the picture plane, or parallel to the painting itself, and part of it recedes into depth. But that part that recedes is perpendicular to that front plane, which means all of its lines are receding to what's called a vanishing point, a single point where all those lines converge. And we can trace those lines and find where they go. And they go immediately between Plato and Aristotle. And that's essential to the meaning of the painting, because it tells us that the painting is about the reconciliation of Plato and Aristotle, and therefore neither one of them could occupy the center. They are on either side of the center, and it means at some point in between them, some invisible distant point, is the place where they'll be integrated and unified. That point sits on a horizon line. The horizon line is the eye line, ideally of a viewer, but also potentially people in the painting. Now, you'll see that this white horizon line doesn't correspond to either the figures on top of the steps nor the figures down below. That's because we're in a room where we actually are lower than even the figures on the floor, which means the horizon line is a compromise between how we would actually see the scene from within the room and what Raphael wants to do to create a balanced scene that allows him to show the floor space and the steps and show the receding into depth of the floor that the philosophers stand upon. So the horizon line is a compromise. It's at the bottom of the arch, or the spring line of the arch, and it's therefore in a kind of an intermediate place below the figures at the top, above the figures down below, and a little above our own natural horizon line, so that it creates a kind of an ideal balance between an illusion and a credible scene. Now, within that great vaulted hall, you've got philosophers doing philosophy. They're philosophers at work, doing the work of philosophy. And what does that mean? Well, in some cases they're writing, and they're sharing or not sharing that information with others who have to peer over their shoulder. Some of them are talking and discussing. Some of them are demonstrating. There's a sense in which philosophy is an active thing. It's a kind of work, and it's done in many different ways. And that sense in which there's variety, but yet order in this composition, that there's a kind of rough symmetry of the figures across the space, but at the same time there's a sense of a kind of an almost casual sense that we've walked into a kind of a community of philosophers doing what they do. Now, the philosophers are at work, but so too is the artist who had to paint this thing. And in order to think about how Raphael went about doing this, we have to be familiar with the idea of the giornata. And the giornata, again, has to do with this idea that you're painting into fresh plaster, thus the word fresco. It's fresh plaster that will accept pigments over the arc of a day, or a giornata, a day's work, 8 to 12 hours, depending on the humidity. And so Raphael's got to take this scene 25 feet wide or so and divide it up into a kind of a patchwork, a quilt of a whole series of smaller giornate that he can accomplish, he or maybe his assistants in some cases. And he's going to work top down, because fresco's messy and dirty, which means you don't want to splatter plaster or paint on what you've already done. So he's going to work top down. And because from one day to the next the plaster never quite matches up perfectly, we can actually see, and restorers have found for us, the seams between the giornate, and this is a map of those giornate, the different days painting. And what we can realize is that Raphael had some very ambitious days where he was painting, in the case of, let's say, he painted Aristotle all in one day, the entire figure, but to the right of Aristotle, or to his left, from his point of view, there are all these figures. There's one figure in the foreground in his bright kind of yellow-orange robes, but a series of faces and partial figures behind, all of that done in one day. Some of that is Raphael trying to rival Michelangelo, who on the Sistine ceiling, which is being painted at roughly the same time, he was also painting some figures in a day. And that was a remarkable achievement, ambitious, bold. And so Raphael has to create out of these, individual days painting a kind of coherent scene, but he's also moving along rapidly. He's chugging through this thing with a kind of dispatch. There are, I think, 21 giornate in the architecture above the figures, and I think there are 33 giornate where the figures actually are. And this is what happens in the end. This great sense of an integrated scene of philosophers under a great vaulted hall, or maybe having just emerged from a great vaulted hall, doing the work of philosophy with tremendous variety and yet integrity and balance and harmony and a kind of perfection that is a hallmark of what Raphael was able to bring to the Renaissance and which defined a kind of perfection of composition for centuries afterwards.